Before we ride into this story, hit like and subscribe. Thank you. Afghanistan, 2006. An Australian Special Air Service patrol lay belly down on a shale shelf above a narrow valley, faces pressed into the cold grit, rifles cradled like sleeping animals. They'd been up there long enough that the mountain had started to accept them, dust settling on sleeves, sweat drying into salt, breath slowed to a rhythm that didn't quite look like breathing at all. Below, far across the draw, a cluster of mud walls and scrub trees marked the edge of a Taliban transit route. The Australians had watched it for 2 nights and a full day, counting footsteps and donkey carts, noting which doorway opened at dawn and which rooftop silhouette appeared only when the wind changed. Then the ridgeline behind them erupted with noise, boots on loose rock, voices carrying like they were calling friends at a bar. A radio squawked, loud enough to make the closest Australian wince. The sound rolled down the slope, bounced off stone, and spilled into the valley as if someone had thrown a bucket of metal parts into a drum. The patrol commander, an older troop sergeant with sunburned knuckles and eyes that never quite stopped scanning, lifted his head a centimeter. Through the corner of his vision, he caught movement. American Special Operations, a small element, cresting the ridge hard and fast. They moved like they were trying to outrun the terrain, shoulders high, gear shifting and clacking, antennas poking into the sky. Somebody said something into a handset at normal speaking volume. Somebody else answered. The valley, which had been a quiet sheet of tension, suddenly felt like it had been slapped awake. The Australian commander didn't swear. He didn't throw a tantrum. He simply pressed his mouth close to his second-in-command's ear and whispered flat and final, "We're pulling out." The second-in-command stared at him like he'd misheard. "They'll get us all killed," the commander added. Hours later, that decision would ricochet up the chain. Questions in Kandahar, raised eyebrows in coalition briefing rooms, quiet irritation from people who hated friction between allies. But up on that shale shelf, it wasn't politics, it was physics. Sound carried, light moved, valleys listened. If you want to understand why 2 elite forces fighting the same enemy could look at the same battlefield and see 2 completely different wars, you have to understand what made the Australian SASR what it was, and what made American Special Operations what it had become by the mid-2000s. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment had been shaped by a particular kind of brutality, not the cinematic brutality of charges and explosions, but the slow, patient cruelty of distance, heat, and hunger. Their reputation wasn't built on being louder or bigger, it was built on being absent. In the Malayan emergency and the Borneo confrontation, patrols learned that survival often depended on being the thing nobody noticed. No footprints where footprints should be, no smoke where men should be cooking, no movement where eyes were always watching. Over time, that mindset hardened into doctrine. Long-range reconnaissance, stealth as a form of firepower, patience as a weapon. Selection was designed to filter for a specific kind of mind. Candidates learned to navigate vast stretches of empty country with minimal kit, to manage hunger and fatigue without the luxury of complaint, to keep going when the only thing pushing them forward was pride and the knowledge that quitting would follow them for the rest of their lives. It wasn't just physical suffering, it was the internal discipline of staying quiet, staying focused, and staying invisible even when your body begged you to be loud about it. By the time the post-9/11 war reached Afghanistan, Australian SAS squadrons had been folded into coalition structures alongside American, British, and Canadian special operations. On paper, it looked perfect. Allied professionals, shared objectives, similar standards, mutually respected combat records. Coalition planners wanted seamless integration, multinational task forces moving like a single organism. But there was a problem nobody could solve with a PowerPoint slide. The Australians were trained to win by being undetected. Many American units, shaped by decades of doctrine that prized tempo, initiative, and overwhelming support, were trained to win by being unavoidable. It wasn't that Americans lacked stealth, it wasn't that Australians lacked aggression, it was deeper than that. 2 philosophies of warfare that started at the root and grew in opposite directions. The first hairline fractures showed up early, in late 2001, in planning spaces around Kandahar airfield. Australian teams arrived expecting briefing discipline that felt almost monastic. Restricted access, tight compartmentalization, quiet voices, minimal electronic chatter. Instead, many walked into rooms alive with constant radio traffic and a bustle of staff moving between stations, coordinating over open nets that, while secure, still felt too loud, too casual, too crowded for men who measured risk in decibels and seconds of exposure. One SAS NCO later described the sensation like stepping into a floodlit stage mid-performance. The Australians were used to building an operation the way you build a trap, slowly, deliberately, with every detail chosen. They'd study terrain and village patterns until they could predict the day by the way a dog crossed a courtyard. They wanted to infiltrate at night, drift into observation hides, and sit so still that the world forgot them. American planning often leaned the other direction. Get there fast, own the moment of contact, keep communications constant, and keep aircraft close enough that a problem could be turned into a solution in minutes. Radios were life, air support was leverage, speed was security. The difference bled into everything: training priorities, kit choices, even what good looked like. Australian patrols tended to strip down. Suppressed weapons were common, electronics were minimized, loose equipment was taped, tied, or wrapped so it couldn't betray them with a single accidental clink. Weight wasn't just a comfort issue, it was noise, fatigue, and time. Everything carried had to justify itself. American loadouts often reflected a different calculus. meticulous. Multiple radios for multiple nets, infrared markers and strobes to talk to aircraft, gear optimized for rapid action and coordination. Firepower and communication weren't indulgences. They were survival tools in a war where the enemy could appear from a ridgeline and vanish into a village in the time it took to blink. Both approaches were born from real experience. Both had saved lives. Both had killed the enemy, but put them on the same hillside, within the same few hundred meters of an alert Taliban observation chain, and those approaches could collide like two weather fronts. The clash became impossible to ignore during major coalition operations. In early 2002, during planning tied to the fight in the Shah-i-Kot Valley, Operation Anaconda, differences in philosophy became differences in timing, insertion, and acceptable risk. Australian commanders favored long infiltrations on foot, building a pattern of life, mapping movement and leadership relationships before committing to direct action. American plans leaned toward speed and mass. Helicopters in, gunships overhead, strike hard, extract clean. In meeting rooms, it could sound like an argument about methods. On the ground, it became an argument about reality. If your success depends on the enemy not knowing you exist, then an ally who arrives like thunder is not just unhelpful, he's dangerous. If your success depends on dominating contact with overwhelming support, then an ally who refuses to talk on the radio feels like a liability. And so quietly, the coalition began to do what coalitions have always done when doctrine refuses to blend. It separated. By the mid-2000s, in places like Uruzgan province, rough country cut with riverbeds, orchards, and villages that could hide fighters as easily as families, the friction wasn't theoretical anymore. Veterans from both sides have described joint missions where the Australians would drift away from American elements, or insist on different routes, or request separate zones. Sometimes it was coordinated, sometimes it was not. One incident, often told in fragments, captured the problem in a way no doctrinal paper ever could. A combined effort was tracking a Taliban figure believed to be moving between mountain compounds near Shah-i-Kot. The Australians moved first, slow, quiet, hands signaling, bodies flowing from shadow to shadow. Their point man paused before every crest, scanning, listening, feeling the wind. Weapons stayed controlled. Footsteps were placed like decisions. Somewhere behind them, the Americans came on harder. The Australians heard them before they saw them. The rattle of unsecured metal, the scrape of hard boots on rock, a short burst of radio traffic. To the Americans, it was normal movement. Professional, purposeful, not reckless. To the Australians, it sounded like an alarm bell ringing down the valley. The patrol commander made his call in seconds. He split his element away, not with an argument, not with a debate, but with a quiet gesture. They slid off their line of advance and melted into terrain that would hide them, moving only when the wind gusted, pausing when the world went still. Through liaison, the Americans were redirected toward an alternate approach that would keep the two elements from stacking on top of each other in the same auditory footprint. Later in debrief, questions came fast. Why the separation? Why no permission? Why no notification? The Australian explanation, recorded in the dry language of operational reporting, was painfully simple. The American movement and electronic signature threatened operational security. The Australians couldn't maintain concealment for close reconnaissance with that level of noise and transmission. It wasn't an insult, it was a diagnosis, and the enemy noticed the difference too. Coalition intelligence at the time repeatedly emphasized Taliban spotters and village networks, eyes on ridgelines, kids on paths, men who could tell who was coming by, how the goats reacted. Fighters learned patterns the way hunters learn animal trails. In some areas, intercepts and reporting suggested Taliban elements could distinguish coalition forces by their signature: helicopter noise echoing through valleys, radio emissions, the cadence of movement, even the simple fact that some patrols arrived loudly and others seemed to appear out of nowhere. The Australians became, in local whispers, the silent ones. The Americans, often arriving with aircraft, QRF planning, and constant comms, became the loud ones. Neither label was fair, both were incomplete. But war doesn't care about fairness. War cares about what the enemy can predict. The doctrinal divide extended into how success was measured. American after-action reporting often centered on engagements: enemy killed, caches destroyed, rounds expended, contact timelines, air assets used. Australian reporting often centered on the invisible work: days undetected, routes mapped, names tied to compounds, patterns confirmed, targeting packages built so someone else could strike with precision later. A liaison officer once summed it up in a line that sounded like a compliment and a warning at the same time. The Australians measured success by what the enemy never knew they'd seen. The Americans measured it by what they destroyed. Both were right, and that was the problem. By the late 2000s, coalition special operations in key regions had evolved into parallel tracks. Australian SAS elements increasingly operated on extended reconnaissance missions, weeks in remote terrain, often far from the comforting reach of large bases. Their intelligence fed coalition targeting cells. American direct action forces and other partners executed raids and strikes, sometimes built on that intelligence, units with their own methods and support structures. It worked because the coalition stopped trying to force two philosophies into one body. But separation came with a cost. When you operate deep, quiet, and alone, you accept a harsh truth. If something goes wrong, help may not arrive in time. And even the best trained patrol can be swallowed by bad luck. An unexpected meeting, a betrayal, a random patrol cresting the wrong ridge at the wrong moment. In 2010, in Kandahar province, an Australian SAS patrol found itself in exactly that kind of nightmare. Details vary depending on who tells it, but the spine of the story remains. An element operating deep in contested terrain made contact under conditions that didn't fit the clean logic of doctrine. The enemy wasn't a handful of startled fighters. It was a force big enough to fix them, pressure them, and threaten to encircle. The Australians fought with the cold efficiency they were known for: disciplined fire, controlled movement, and instinctive refusal to panic. But the terrain was against them, distance was against them, and the very independence that made them effective now threatened to make them unreachable. When the emergency call went out, the unit that moved to answer it wasn't Australian, it was American. A quick reaction force, trained for speed, built around coordination, backed by aircraft and constant comms, did what it was designed to do. It came loud, fast and unapologetic. Helicopters clawed at thin air over ridgelines. Radios stitched together a picture of a fight that was changing by the minute. Fire support was brought in with the kind of efficiency that only comes from relentless practice and a culture that treats communication as oxygen. To the Taliban, it must have felt like the mountain itself had turned hostile. The extraction, whether it was a full break contact undercover, a hard landing under fire, or a moving shield of air and ground support depending on the account, became the kind of moment both forces remembered for years. Not because it proved one doctrine superior, but because it proved something more uncomfortable. You could not always choose the kind of war you wanted to fight. Sometimes the silent ones needed the loud ones. Sometimes the loud ones needed the silent ones to find what could not be found by force alone. The coalition's strength wasn't in turning everyone into the same kind of operator. It was in understanding what each approach could do and what each approach could not do, and building plans that respected those boundaries. By the time Australian combat forces withdrew from Afghanistan in 2013, the model had matured into an unspoken agreement. Separate insertion methods, separate operational rhythms, separate techniques, unified objectives, shared intelligence, mutual respect earned the hard way. The Australians would see what others couldn't by living inside the enemy's blind spots. The Americans would hit with speed and weight when the moment demanded it. One senior American voice reportedly summarized the evolution in plain terms: the Australians find what we can't. We destroy what they find. It works because we stopped trying to do it the same way. And maybe that's the real lesson hidden inside that shale shelf in 2006, when an Australian commander listened to the valley, heard the approaching thunder of allies, and chose to disappear rather than die. Because in Afghanistan, the enemy was not just the man with the rifle. Sometimes it was the noise you didn't realize you were making.